Will you marry me?
Yes.
Yes?
Rich men don't know how to please a woman, she said at the bar, already disappointed. The billionaire next to her smiled. Then prove it with me. Clara Vane didn't say that to seduce anyone. She said it because she was tired of men who confused desire with possession, charm with money, attention with control. But Cale Ashford listened, and instead of taking offense, he made a proposal that sounded like pure arrogance. She would pick the places, the topics, the tests, and he would prove her wrong. Clara accepted in order to humiliate him. She just didn't expect him to listen to every word, every silence, every wound she was trying to hide. And when the game started to feel like a feeling, it was too late to pretend it was still just a challenge.
Hi, I'm Rowan. A special shout out to those of you watching Book 1 for free here on the My Stories platform, completely ad-free and uninterrupted.
Chapter 1. The Line at the Bar. The rain was falling over Tribeca as if it were in a hurry to drown the night. Clara Vane pushed the door of the Italian restaurant harder than she needed to and crossed the already soaked sidewalk, her thin heels sinking into dark puddles that reflected crooked signs. Inside her purse, the receipt for a check she had paid herself burned like proof of stubbornness, and the smell of expensive tomato sauce still insisted on clinging to her coat collar. The investor, a name she was already determined to forget, had talked about himself for 2 full hours, interrupted every sentence of hers with the patience of someone waiting only for the echo of his own voice, and tried in the end to slide his black card across the table, as if that closed something between them. Clara had smiled with the cold delicacy she'd learned from her mother, slid the card back, and asked for the card reader. She walked out with her head high. She also walked out with smudged lipstick at the corner of her mouth, and it was only in the window of a closed shop, seeing her own reflection blurred by the water, that she noticed. She didn't fix it. She walked the 2 blocks to the bar, where Wren was already waiting, her hair dripping, her eyeliner running a thin line down her temple, and pushed the glass door open with the feeling of someone walking into a warm place only as punishment. The smell of new leather and aged bourbon hit her even before the music did. The Tribeca bar had that kind of lighting that makes even a glass of water look expensive. Dark wood, waxed to a shine, bottles lined up like books in a private library, a discreet pianist in the back playing something no one was really listening to. Wren Halliday, assistant curator at the MoMA and her best friend for 15 years, was on a high stool near the counter, short hair undone by the humidity, sharp eyes, one glass already half empty, and her other hand holding her phone face down. "You look like you just killed someone," Wren said with no greeting. "I should have killed him," Clara replied, letting her coat slide onto the seat next to her. She ordered a strong drink, elbow propped on the bar and her other hand trying to save her hair from the rain. The bartender, in an impeccable grey vest, slid the glass over to her without asking anything more, and the ice clinked against the glass as if greeting an old acquaintance. Wren tapped the counter twice with her short nail, the old gesture of someone about to say something serious, and asked if it had really been that bad. Clara told it in short sentences. The man had talked about his own wine collection, as if Clara should take notes. He had shown his wristwatch at least 3 times. He had suggested a symbolic position at his foundation in exchange for a lighter schedule for both of them. In other words, Wren concluded, glass in the air, he wanted to buy you in units of time. He wanted to buy my silence about the fact that he's unbearable. They laughed together, that short laugh women give when exhaustion no longer allows for a long one. Clara drank half her drink in one gulp and felt the alcohol go down like a delayed answer, burning her chest in an almost kind way. She thought of her mother in Maine, with the old wedding ring on the ring finger of a hand that hadn't quite obeyed since the stroke. She thought of the way Margot touched that ring whenever she remembered the man who had promised to stay, and had vanished even before knowing there was a Clara inside her. The memory rose acidic through the same channel the whiskey was going down. "You know what I think?" Clara said, and her voice came out a notch higher than she intended, because the alcohol had already met her exhaustion and joined hands with it. "Rich men don't know how to please a woman. They only know how to buy silence." The pianist turned a page of his score. A bottle clinked somewhere behind the bar, and the man on the stool next to her, whom Clara only now registered as a presence and not a shadow, slowly lowered the glass he was holding in a gesture too measured to be casual. She noticed the suit before the face. Dark, well cut, no sheen, the kind that asks not to be noticed and is noticed for that very reason. The sleeves still buttoned at the cuff, the fabric falling clean over the broad shoulder. The large hand wrapped around the glass with the calm of a man who had already decided what he was going to say and was simply giving his own words time. When he finally looked, Clara discovered he was the kind of man whose attention had weight. Dark eyes, lashes lowered for a second, then steady. There was no rush in his mouth. There was the outline of a smile, and the outline alone was already dangerous. "Then prove it with me," he said. His voice was low, so low that Clara had to lean half an inch closer to confirm she'd actually heard him. Wren choked discreetly on her wine and set the glass down with the exaggerated care of someone trying not to interrupt a scene she recognized. "Excuse me," Clara asked, more out of principle than doubt. "You just made a categorical statement," he explained, without changing his tone, "about an entire category of men. I belong to it. I think it's fair to give you a chance to test the thesis, and you are Cale Ashford." Wren tapped the counter twice, then a third time, against her own rule, and murmured, "Clara, you might want to sit back down." Clara didn't sit. She looked at Wren as if demanding a translation, and her friend just lifted her eyebrows in a pattern that said roughly, hotels, vineyards, an entire cultural foundation, meaning a man who owns more buildings than he knows people. Clara turned back to Cale Ashford, with her posture recomposed and the sharp smile already back in place, even as she felt her pulse beat one extra time in her neck. "Is this an indecent proposal?" she asked. "No," he answered. "It's a possible one." "Is there a difference?" "Yes." Cale set down the glass. There was no theatre in the gesture. It was simply the way of someone lowering his shield to show he would talk with empty hands. His fingers stayed for a moment on the wood, not tapping, not retreating, as if the silence were also part of what was being proposed there. "One night," he went on, "you pick the places, you pick the topics, you pick the tests. I'm not allowed to buy anything. Not dinner, not anyone's silence, not your goodwill. If at the end you stand by the line, I accept the line. If you change it, I accept the change." Clara crossed her arms on the counter. Outside, the rain was hitting harder now against the awnings, and the room seemed to have shrunk around the three of them. The pianist eased into a slower piece, in a low register, and the smell of Cale's drink, something woody, with no sweetness, reached her when he moved half an inch. Wren, at the corner of her vision, was pretending deep interest in the cherry in her glass. "Why?" Clara asked. "Why what? Why do you want to prove something to a stranger with smudged lipstick in a bar?" Cale took half a second. It was a loaded half-second, the kind that makes a person seem more whole than he claimed to be. His gaze went down to the glass and came back, unhurried, and his right hand closed once slowly before relaxing again on the counter. "Because you spoke about someone I know without realizing it," he answered, in an even lower voice. "You were right in part. I wouldn't want you to have been right about all of it." Clara opened her mouth to answer and couldn't, because something inside her had just shifted without asking permission. It was a small displacement, almost invisible, like the moment an old fresco sheds a layer of dust and reveals a brushstroke that had been there the whole time, hidden beneath centuries of soot and indifference. She hated that shift. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, and gave back the thin smile she kept for editorial boards and boring dinners. "You know I accepted this to humiliate you, right?" she said. "I know," Cale answered, and he almost smiled for real. The corner of his mouth lifted a millimeter and came down again as if its owner had confiscated the gesture before it could escape. "And you still want to?" "I do." Wren coughed an entire sentence behind her napkin, something between "Sir, have some sense" and "Clara, call me later." Clara ignored both voices. She picked up her purse, finished her drink in another swallow, and looked Cale Ashford up and down with a calm that was pure provocation, registering without meaning to the way he held that look without flinching or fidgeting. "Let's go now," she said. "Now." "Now." Cale stood up without asking where to. Chapter 2. Burger and Marguerite. The bar door closed behind Clara with a muffled thud, and the rain found her again on the Tribeca sidewalk as if it had never stopped. She lifted her face to the sky for a second, feeling the water run down her already ruined makeup, and thought there was still time to change her mind. Cale Ashford stopped beside her without touching anything, without offering an umbrella, without calling a car. He simply waited. "Are you sure you want to go now?" he asked, his voice quieter than the noise of wet traffic. "I am," Clara replied, adjusting the coat over her shoulders. "You're the one who still has a chance to back out." His smile appeared for a brief instant, more shadow than smile, and disappeared before she could decide what to do with it. A yellow cab pulled up at the curb, and it was Clara who hailed it. She got in first. He got in after, folding his large body to fit into the back seat without crowding her space. The driver asked where to, and Clara gave the name of a diner in Queens she'd known since her college years, the grungiest she could think of, fluorescent lighting, a cracked formica counter, waitresses serving reheated coffee in thick ceramic mugs. Through the fogged window, she watched the bridge approach. She imagined Cale wrinkling his nose, asking to stop earlier, citing an early meeting. She glanced sideways. He had his face turned to the glass, watching the city go by like someone watching a painting he'd seen many times and still hadn't deciphered. The diner smelled of old grease and pine disinfectant. A single bulb flickered above the counter. Behind the register, stuck on with yellowed tape, there was a photo of a boy of about 7 holding a fish bigger than himself. Clara picked a stool in the middle of the counter on purpose, so that Cale would have to sit between 2 other customers, an older man in a cap and a woman in nurse's scrubs dozing over her own arm. He sat down without comment. He took off his wet jacket, folded it in half with almost impersonal care, and laid it on the empty stool to his right. Then, with the same slow movement, he rolled up the sleeves of his white shirt to his elbows. His forearms appeared firm, with the pale skin of someone who spent little time in the sun. Clara noticed and looked away, before he could notice she had noticed. The waitress arrived, dragging the soles of her sneakers. The name tag on her chest said Hadley in crooked capital letters. She slapped her pad against the counter. "Coffee for both of you?" she asked, without looking. "Please," Cale said. Hadley looked up, found the please odd, sized up the man in the soaked suit for half a second and went back to the pad. She poured 2 cups. Cale's got a little more. He picked up the laminated menu, with dried sauce stains on the edges, and read the whole thing. Not at a glance, he actually read it. He ran his finger over the items, paused on one, went back to the beginning, compared prices. Clara watched in silence, waiting for the moment when he would order a salad and prove herself right. "The house burger," Cale said, handing the menu back to Hadley. "Well done, and more coffee when you can." Hadley wrote it down. He tilted his chin toward the photo stuck behind the register, without pointing with his finger, without intruding. "What's the boy's name?" The waitress froze for a second. She looked at the photo as if remembering it existed. Then she looked at Cale. "Matteo," she said. "He's 8. "Matteo," Cale repeated quietly, almost just for himself. "Nice fish." Hadley gave a short smile, the kind that slips out without permission, and walked off, shouting the order toward the kitchen. Clara fixed her eyes on her own coffee. Something shifted inside her chest, just a millimeter, and she pushed it back into place. "Do you always do that?" Clara asked, scraping her spoon against the saucer for no reason. "Do what?" "Ask the name." He thought for a moment before answering, not like someone hunting for a pretty line, like someone checking whether the truth still fit in that sentence. "When there's a photo at the register, it's because somebody wanted people to ask," he said. "It would be rude not to take them up on it." Clara turned her face to hide a smile she hadn't authorized. She drank the bitter coffee in one go. The burger arrived on a crooked tray, with too many fries and a pickle in the corner. Cale ate with both hands, no ceremony, no performing ease. He wiped the corners of his mouth with the cheap napkin. He asked for more coffee twice. He didn't complain about the fluorescent light, didn't check his watch, didn't take his phone out of his pocket a single time. Clara decided to switch weapons. She put down the spoon. "I restore frescoes," she said, in a tone she dropped onto the counter the way you drop a test card. "Wall paintings in churches, in old mansions, in buildings nobody looks at anymore. Most of my work is on invisible women." Cale looked up without letting go of his cup. "What do you mean, invisible women?" "In almost every old Italian fresco there's a female figure in the background, carrying a jug, holding a basket, looking sideways at a scene where men are deciding something important. When the paint starts to peel, the first face to disappear is always hers. It costs less to restore the landscape. It costs more to restore the servant. Almost no one asks for that." He set the cup down. He didn't answer right away. He stayed silent in that way of someone weighing whether the sentence deserved a quick echo or a slow one. "The people who decide what's expensive to restore," Cale said at last, "usually aren't the ones who got painted into the background." Clara looked at him for real for the first time that night. Not the way you size up an enemy. The way you check a sentence to see if it can hold its own weight. "No," she answered, "almost never." There was a pause. Hadley passed behind the counter wiping a tray. The man in the cap left, dropping change onto the saucer. Cale slid a folded bill under the napkin, a tip double the price of the check with no fanfare. "There's a book," Clara said, more to the coffee than to him, "that I saw once at a literature exhibit a few years back. First edition by Marguerite Duras, The Lover. It was behind glass. I couldn't take the glass off. I never found another." Cale didn't comment. He gave a small nod like someone making a note. Clara thought he'd let it pass. Better that way, she thought. Cleaner to let it pass. The conversation drifted to other things. A trip she'd taken to Ravenna at 24, a Georgian wine she'd hated, the name of an obscure 16th century painter only she seemed to know in the neighborhood. At some point, he mentioned, without making a thing of it, that he had lost a book that mattered in a fire when he was 22. He didn't say which one. He didn't embellish. She asked if it had been at home. He said yes and changed the subject, with the delicacy of someone closing a drawer before anyone could see what was inside. When they left the diner, it was almost 3 in the morning. The rain had let up, leaving the asphalt shiny under the neon lights. Clara pulled her coat tighter and asked, with an irony already more tired than sharp, "Next test." "May I propose one?" Cale asked. She raised an eyebrow, agreed only with her chin. The cab drove back over the bridge. Cale gave an address on Mercer Street, on a stretch of closed-up storefronts that Clara knew in passing, but had never gone into. When the car stopped, all she saw was a dim facade, a dark wooden door between 2 shuttered windows. No sign, no light. He got out first this time and rang a bell she hadn't even seen. It took a while. It took so long that Clara almost said something. Finally, a yellow light came on inside, and an elderly man in striped pajamas, glasses on the tip of his nose, opened the door with the look of someone who had been woken up and was not the least bit pleased about it. "Cale," the old man said, with no greeting. "It's 3 in the morning." "I know, Arthur, I'm sorry." The man looked at Clara, then at Cale, and sighed like someone giving up on an old argument. He opened the door wider. The bookshop was small and far too deep, with dark wood shelves reaching the ceiling, iron ladders leaning against the walls, and a dense smell of aged paper and wax. Cale walked down the center aisle like someone who knew every shelf. He climbed half a ladder, felt along a high row, took out a volume wrapped in tissue paper, came down, and set it on the wooden counter without handing it over right away. "You can open it," he said. Clara hesitated. She stepped closer. She unfolded the paper. It was The Lover, first edition, cream cover with small letters in faded red, spine almost intact, a dedication scratched out in brown ink on the flyleaf. She ran her fingertip over the title with the same care she used on Quattrocento fresco fragments. It took her a few seconds to understand that he had found the book she'd mentioned 3 hours earlier, in passing, without asking for anything. The chill that ran up her back wasn't from the rain. She looked at Cale. He was on the other side of the counter, sleeves still rolled up, damp hair falling slightly over his forehead, waiting the way he had waited at the diner, on the sidewalk, in the cab. No rush to receive an answer, no expectation on his face. Arthur, the old man in pajamas, mumbled something about settling the account in the morning and disappeared into the back. Clara held the book with both hands. She felt the exact weight of it. She also felt, somewhere inside her, something slip out of place and fail to return. The whole strategy of the night, The grungy diner, the reheated coffee, the invisible women, the Duras tossed out like a stone into water to see if it would sink. All of it had been designed to humiliate him, to catch him in the moment when the dark suit gave itself away as absurd, to prove to her mother deep down, without ever saying it to her, that the world was still the same way it had always been. He listened. Clara pressed the cream-colored cover against her chest, without realizing she was pressing it, and lifted her eyes to Cale Ashford, with the cold shock of someone who has just discovered she lost a match at the exact moment she believed she was winning. Chapter 3. The Pullback in the Cab. The first week after the Tribeca bar passed in fragments, Clara couldn't quite put in order. Cale Ashford asked for nothing, demanded no reply, didn't send expensive flowers wrapped in ribbons she would have thrown away on principle. He sent short messages, spaced out, with a sobriety that bordered on delicacy. He asked about the fresco she was cleaning. He commented, in a text sent at 7 in the morning, that the Marguerite Duras book she'd been given at the bookstore on Mercer Street had first been published in 1984, and that the owner, Arthur, remembered every copy he sold. Clara read the message twice before answering it with a simple, "Thank you." She kept staring at the screen afterward, annoyed with herself for feeling the urge to write more. The cursor blinked in the white field, as if demanding a honesty she wasn't yet willing to hand over. Days later, he showed up at the studio in Long Island City. No driver waiting on the corner, no overly expensive suit, no asking if he could come in. He knocked on the metal door with 2 knuckles, lifted a paper bag when she opened, and only said he'd brought coffee because he was already in the area. Clara doubted "in the area," but accepted the cup. The coffee was the way she drank it, dark, no sugar, scalding the lips. Cale stayed 5 minutes. He looked at the frescoes being restored with the same attention he'd given to the grimy menu of the Queen's Diner. He didn't touch anything. He asked about a female figure in the lower left corner. An anonymous Saint Clara was returning to the wall of a small country chapel. She answered with her head down, pretending to keep working. When she looked up, Cale had already thanked her and left. The paper bag was on the workbench, still warm. Clara spent the afternoon wanting to throw it in the trash and not throwing it. "He came back?" Wren asked on the phone that night, in that voice of someone who already knows the answer. "I just tapped twice on the imaginary counter here, Clara. He came back." "He brought coffee," Clara replied, lying on the couch, staring at the damp-stained ceiling. "He stayed 5 minutes. He left." "And you?" "I worked." Wren laughed softly on the other end. "You work thinking about the man. That's different." Clara hung up without answering. She stared at the ceiling a little longer, counting the stains the way she counted pigments on an old wall. She felt like disagreeing and had no argument. The following Wednesday, he invited her to a gallery in Chelsea, a small exhibit, no cocktail, no photographers. Cale arrived by cab, not in a car with a driver, and Clara registered the detail without commenting. They walked through the rooms in comfortable silence, the burnt concrete floor returning the sound of her heels in small echoes. In front of a dark Rothko canvas, he asked if she had ever cried in a museum. Clara said yes. He didn't ask why. He just said that he had too, once, in Florence, in front of a badly restored fresco. The restorer had made a pigment mistake in the tunic, and the Virgin's face had ended up too green. Clara laughed, really laughed, without later holding it against herself. It was a dry laugh, short, but it was a laugh. They left the gallery at 11:30 at night, and the rain had come back. Not the heavy rain of Tribeca, but a fine drizzle that wet you without warning. Cale raised his arm and a cab pulled up immediately. Clara thought it was unfair that even the city's water obeyed that man. He opened the door for her first. He got in after. He gave the address of her building in the Lower East Side before she had to say it, and Clara registered that detail too, with a thin tightness she couldn't quite name. It was in the cab that it happened. The street was jammed near the tunnel. The smell of old leather from the seat mixed with Cale's discreet cologne, something of cedar, of clean skin, of an expensive thing made not to announce its price. The driver braked suddenly to avoid a cyclist, and Clara slid a little on the seat. Cale lifted his arm by reflex. His hand met the fabric at her waist, paused there over the still wet trench coat, without really settling. Clara felt the warmth through 2 layers of cloth. She also felt with almost cruel clarity that she had hesitated for half a second. It wasn't a flinch of the body, it was a flinch of breath. A half-second. Cale noticed. She saw it in the way his jaw hardened for an instant. His hand pulled back. It returned to his own knee, palm turned up, like someone showing there was no gesture there at all. He looked out the window. He didn't comment. Clara looked at her own hand closed around her purse. She felt the urge to say it hadn't been fear of him. It had been fear of herself. She didn't say it. She looked at his profile lit by the orange of the streetlights and thought that never in her whole life had a rich man pulled back his hand because of half a second of hesitation. They pressed forward. They always pressed forward. That was what they did. "Do you always give up that fast?" Clara asked before she could think. Cale turned his face slowly. There was no theatre in his eyes, none of that dangerous smile from the bar. There was something quieter, more naked, something she couldn't frame in any word she knew. "I didn't give up," he said low. "I waited." The drizzle tapped against the glass in small clicks. Clara closed her mouth. The rest of the ride passed in silence, and the silence was the loudest thing about the night. On Sunday, she agreed to go up to the terrace of his suite at the Ashford Hotel. She decided on the way that she was accepting in order to confirm a suspicion that a five-star hotel terrace was a set, and sets can be struck. The private elevator delivered her straight into a silent anteroom, with the warm smell of waxed wood. Cale was waiting for her barefoot on the rug, in a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and Clara lost for 2 seconds the list of defences she'd prepared in the cab. They went out to the terrace. View of the park, buildings sunk into the dark like teeth. The wind hit her shoulders cold and smelled of wet leaves. He poured a wine she hadn't asked for. White, cold, simple. He leaned against the railing and looked out at the park, and Clara, beside him, noticed there was no music playing. No setting, after all. "I grew up poor," Cale said out of nowhere, with no dramatic inflection. "My mother cleaned the rooms of men who never once looked at her." The sentence came out the way things come out when they cost little to say, because they cost a lot to be said for the first time elsewhere, at another hour. Clara turned her face slowly. He kept looking at the park. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you asked in the cab if I always give up fast." Cale spun the wineglass between his fingers once. "I learned not to give up too early when I was 11, in a hotel kitchen waiting for my mother to finish the overnight shift. I thought it was fair to say." Clara held her own glass with both hands, feeling the cold glass against her fingers. She wanted to ask a real question, about his mother, about her name, about where it had been. She held back. Not in defense this time, out of respect. It was a new impulse, this, and she didn't yet know the size of it. "Thank you," she said instead of the question. "For telling me." Cale nodded slightly. He didn't ask for anything in return. He stayed there at the railing with his sleeve folded over the wrist, and Clara noticed for the first time that the skin of his arm had a small scar, white the size of a coin, old surely from a place she would never go. He dropped her off at home just before midnight. The car pulled up in front of her building. Cale didn't get out, didn't make any move to come up, didn't ask for anything. He wished her good night in the low voice she already recognized, without touching her, and the distance between their hands weighed more than any touch would have. Clara climbed the 3 flights of stairs with the keys clenched in her palm. She closed the door of her apartment and stood in the dark of the hallway, leaning against the wood, feeling her heart beat at a rhythm that wasn't the one from before the bar. She took off her coat. She turned on the living room lamp, and the yellow light fell in a short circle over the rug. She sat on the floor with her back against the couch and looked at the wall where there was a scaled-down copy of a fresco she had restored 2 years before. An anonymous woman in profile with her eyes lowered. She thought of her mother. She thought of Margot waking up at 5 in the morning in the house in Maine without anyone really knowing why. She thought of the line at the bar. Rich men don't know how to please a woman. They only know how to buy silence. And how she had sworn that line to her mother without ever having said out loud to her mother that she swore it. Cale had not tried to buy her. He had pulled back half a second in the cab and had told her in a short sentence on the terrace something he certainly hadn't said to anyone in years. He wasn't the man from the script she had mentally written at the bar in Tribeca. He was somebody else, and the somebody else didn't fit into any of the drawers she'd learned to keep locked since childhood. Clara closed her eyes. She felt, with the thin tightness that was starting to feel familiar, that the whole strategy of the night at the bar, humiliate him, prove him wrong, send him off, had been in pieces for some time now, and she was only now gathering the shards on the floor to understand what had broken and what it left exposed underneath. She picked up her phone. She opened the conversation with Cale. She typed 3 words, deleted, typed 2 others, deleted. She left the phone on the rug, the lit screen turned face down, as if that way the temptation would stop breathing. She spent the night awake, deciding what to do with all of it. Chapter 4. Gala on the Upper East Saturday afternoon. Entered the Lower East Side apartment in layers of pale light. Cutting through the raw linen curtains Clara never remembered to close until night. On the bed, the moss-green dress lay like a tame animal, and next to it the sober note Cale had sent 3 days earlier was still on the dresser. 4 lines, no flourishes, asking only if she would accept walking in on his arm at the Foundation's gala. Clara looked at the fabric for the 3rd time in an hour. The green had the exact tone of the pigments she used in early Renaissance frescoes, and the coincidence bothered her in a way she couldn't yet turn into a sentence. Wren, sitting cross-legged on the floor, looked up from her laptop and tapped the parquet twice with a burgundy-painted nail. "Stop measuring that dress like it's a trap. He sent you a dress, Clara, not a merger proposal." "With that man, the difference is smaller than it looks," Clara answered, and walked around the bed to grab her phone. The video call took 3 rings for her mother to answer. Margot's face filled the screen with the slow calm of someone who had learned to make pauses a form of speech. Behind her, the main window showed the same crooked pine. Her hand rose to her ring finger and touched the old wedding band in a gesture Clara had known all her life, without ever having asked who that ring had truly belonged to. "You've got that look," Margot said with her drawn-out country accent. "The one of a girl who's already decided to go and is still asking permission." "I'm not asking permission, Mom." "Yes, you are." Margot gave a small smile. "Sweetheart, does this man listen to you?" Clara gripped the phone harder than she needed to. She felt inside her chest the short step between trained cynicism and the truthful answer. She thought of the name Matteo said in a low voice at a grimy counter, of the book she had pressed against her chest on an October dawn, of the hand that had pulled back from her waist inside a cab in the drizzle. "He does," she admitted. Margot stayed quiet for a long moment. The finger remained on the ring. "Then take care of your heart. A man who listens is the one who hurts most when he hurts." Clara hung up before her throat could close up completely. Wren watched her from the floor without commenting, and exactly because of that, Clara was able to take a deep breath and turn back to the dress. She got dressed in silence, let Wren pin her hair into a low bun that freed the curve of her neck, and when she saw herself in the mirror she didn't recognize the lipstick, dry red exact, no smudges. It was armor older than she was. The car pulled up at 20 to 8. Cale stepped out first, dark, impeccably cut suit, hand extended without theatre. His eyes swept over the dress in silence, lingered a second at her shoulders, and came back to her face with something that wasn't possession. It was confirmation. "You chose the green," he observed quietly. "You knew I would." "I was hoping," he answered, and opened the door. The Upper East Side ballroom blazed with high light. Old chandeliers, cream stucco walls, women with bare backs talking as if every word were a small negotiation. Clara entered with her arm linked through Cale's and felt at the exact moment they crossed the threshold, the whole room measure the inch between their bodies. There was no room for smudged lipstick there. There was room for posture. Cale guided her to the first group with the ease of a man who knew exactly how much weight to put against her elbow. Almost nothing, just enough so she would notice the care. He introduced her 3 times by her full name, Clara Vane, Fresco Restorer, never as a companion, never as the lady. Every time he repeated it, she felt her shoulders relax half a millimeter. Odette Marsh appeared by the 4th group, with the precision of someone who had rehearsed her entrance into the room 2 floors below. Short black dress, heavy pearl necklace, short laugh leaving her throat before the words. She kissed the air to the left and to the right of Clara's face without making contact. "Well, what a belle surprise," she said. French cutting the sentence in two. Cale never brings compagnie to galas. You must be very special, chérie. Odette's hand rose to the necklace and stayed there, fingers curved around a pearl larger than the others. I'm a restorer, Clara replied with a thin smile. I'm not company. Ah, mais bien sûr, the short laugh again. It's just that I've known Cale for so long, you know, from the Sorbonne, so many afternoons at that café behind Rue des Écoles. Clara held the smile. She felt the air sweeten at the edges, the way it sweetens when someone lies too close to you. How interesting. You spent a semester in Paris, didn't you, in 2012, if the memory of someone who read your interview in Cultured serves. The pearl between Odette's fingers gave a small jerk. The short laugh didn't come this time. It was a formative semester, she corrected, lowering her chin. I imagine. Clara tilted her head, ever so polite. From what I've read, Cale did his undergrad in New York. I imagine the cafes were others. The silence that settled there lasted half a second longer than Odette could bear. She adjusted the necklace, threw a side glance at Cale, who was watching the exchange from 3 steps away, apparently in conversation with a white-haired man, but with his body turned toward Clara, and stepped back a millimeter to the side. Enchanté, in any case, Odette murmured. Likewise. Cale came over at the exact moment Odette stepped away. He didn't comment on the scene. He simply placed his hand at the base of Clara's back, just 2 fingers, and guided her out of the circle. Clara felt the warmth through the moss-green fabric like a small private mark. You're doing better than he expected, said a dry voice behind her. Phelan Marsh appeared the way a man appears, without entry, rimless glasses, grey suit, half-empty whiskey glass. He took off his glasses, cleaned them with a linen handkerchief, put them back on. Who? Clara asked. Me. Phelan gave a half-smile that barely moved his mouth. Cale warned me you'd cut Odette off before the second French word. I bet on the third. Lost $20 to my own client. Clara couldn't contain the short laugh. It was the first honest sound she had let out in the whole ballroom. You bet on me. I bet on everybody, Miss Vane. Phelan cleaned the glasses again with no obvious need. It's how I read people. You're easy to read and hard to predict. Rare combination. Cale, beside her, looked at Phelan without moving his head. Phelan lifted his glass in silence, turned and disappeared toward the bar, leaving Clara with the strange feeling of having passed an exam she didn't know she was taking. The night moved in waves. Short speeches about exhibits, benefactors clapping in just the right rhythm, a string quartet playing Debussy with technique and no soul. Clara caught herself watching Cale from a distance twice. Once when, with a minimal nod of his head, he dismissed a platinum-haired woman who came too close. Another when he adjusted the angle of his body so that a curator was out of Clara's line of sight, as if sparing her from a conversation he had already calculated to be tedious. The geography of his possession was not loud. It was architecture. Around 11, she needed air. She crossed the ballroom to a side door that opened onto a narrow terrace overlooking the lit gardens of the neighboring museum. She leaned against the stone balustrade, took a deep breath, felt her lipstick dry at the corners of her mouth for the first time that night. She didn't hear Cale arrive. She sensed him by the change in the air. He stopped beside her, without touching. He left a respectful space between their elbows on the stone. Do you want to go? He asked, his voice low. Not yet. Cale nodded once. He looked out at the garden. Clara noticed his right hand was closed a little tighter than usual, and that his thumb was touching his ring finger in a small repeated gesture. Are you okay? She asked, and the question came out before she could filter it. He took 3 seconds. Big rooms weigh on me. Since I was 11. He spoke looking at the garden, not at her. My hand shakes a little before I walk in. Tonight it shook twice. Clara held back the impulse to touch his wrist. Instead, she rested her own elbow 3 centimeters from his on the balustrade, close enough for him to feel it, far enough that he could pull away without having to explain. Why did you come then? Because you were going to walk in with me. His voice didn't rise. And because a man only finds out it's no longer the room weighing on him when he walks through one with someone he'd choose again. Clara closed her eyes for a second. She felt the moss green rise and fall with her breathing, and the line from the Tribeca bar drifted through the back of her head without her being able to use it as a weapon. Rich men don't know how to please a woman. It sounded old. It sounded small. "You're difficult," she said quietly. "I know. So am I." "I know." Cale let a half-smile appear and die. "That's why I lifted my glass." She was going to answer. She opened her mouth, felt the word rise, and that was the moment she turned her face toward the ballroom. Behind a tall vase of dried palm fronds, near the side door she had come through, a man in a poorly cut blazer was holding a phone up. Dark screen, discreet lens, but unmistakable in the geometry of someone taking a photo without permission. He noticed Clara's look half a second too late. He lowered the device fast, too fast, and disappeared into the corridor. And farther back, standing at the mouth of the hallway that led to the restrooms, with the golden light falling from above, Odette Marsh was holding her own pearl necklace closed in her right hand. She was looking at the terrace. She had no short laugh now. She had a still smile, a smile without a mouth, the kind that belongs only to the eyes when the eyes have already decided something. Clara took a step back from the balustrade without realizing it. Cale noticed. Clara felt it in the way his body turned half a degree toward her, alert. "What is it?" Clara didn't answer right away. She looked at the empty corridor, at the vase, at the spot where Odette had been, and where now no one stood. She felt the moss green suddenly weigh on her like armor too old to fit. "I think I just got photographed," she said. Cale's hand on the stone closed for an instant, opened again, slowly. Chapter 5. Press conference in the lobby. Morning came grey over the Lower East Side, with a light that looked filtered through old paper. Through the foggy kitchen window, the buildings across the street had blurred outlines, like watercolour still damp. Clara was barefoot on the cold floor, in the oversized t-shirt from the night before, and the smell of coffee forgotten in the pot was starting to turn bitter when she heard Wren come in with the spare key. Her friend didn't tap twice on anything. She just crossed the hallway holding her tablet against her chest, like someone holding a diagnosis not yet said out loud. "Sit down," Wren asked, and the short tone, with no irony, none of the usual jokes, was more alarming than any word. Clara didn't sit. She held out her hand. The tablet came warm, still glowing from the trip, and the screen pulsed with a headline red that weighed on her fingers. The first photo was she herself, soaked through, at the door of the Tribeca bar, with smudged lipstick and a held-back laugh. The second showed Cale's hand almost on her waist, inside the cab in the drizzle, at the exact second he pulled back. Seen from the outside, with no context, it looked like possession. The headline used the word plaything. The source, according to the tabloid, was a close friend of socialite Odette Marsh. Clara read it twice. Then she read the caption of the third photo, taken at the gala, and felt her throat tighten in a specific way. That old tightness, the one that belonged to her mother, the one she had spent 10 years swearing she would never inherit. "Has he seen it?" she asked, handing the tablet back. Phelan called at 6:30. He spent the night with the legal and PR teams setting up the logistics. Cale called a press conference at the hotel lobby for late afternoon. Wren set the tablet on the counter carefully, and this time the gesture looked like an apology. "Sweetheart, I know you want to go, but if you go, you walk into the center of this." "I'm already in the center of this." Clara went to her bedroom and put on black pants, a white blouse, no makeup, her wet hair tied at the back. Her phone vibrated 3 times with Cale's name. She didn't pick up, not out of anger, out of an instinct she couldn't translate at that moment, and which she would later recognize as the fear of hearing his voice too low and losing her nerve. She caught a cab at the corner of Essex. The driver looked in the rearview mirror, recognized the face from the photo, opened his mouth to comment something, and gave up when she fixed her gaze on the window. The city went by in grey blurs, with thin rain streaking the glass on a diagonal. At some light near 14th, Clara realized her hands were clenched so tightly inside her coat that her nails had marked her palms. The lobby of the Ashford Hotel in Midtown looked like a waiting room with the face of an opera. Pale marble, low chandeliers, plants too tall to be real. The air had that smell of polished wax mixed with expensive perfume, and the echo of heels on the stone gave the scene the tone of a church on the eve of a baptism. There were people with cameras, people with microphones, people with earpieces and tablets like Wren's. Clara came in through the revolving door, crossed unrecognized by the first two journalists, and on the third, someone said her name out loud. The room turned as one block. That was when Cale saw her. He was in front of a small improvised podium, with Phelan beside him, rimless glasses, the posture of a man who had slept 3 hours. Cale wore a dark suit, no tie, his hair combed back as though it had been done by the hand of a man in a hurry. When his gaze reached Clara's, his right hand, resting on the edge of the podium, trembled for a second. It was a small tremor, the kind he had described on a balcony months earlier in a sentence she still remembered word for word. Clara saw it, registered it, kept walking. The flashes began. Someone asked if she was the girl from the bar. Another wanted to know if she had received any settlement. Wren appeared beside her, gripped her elbow with the firmness of someone holding a horse, and gently pushed her to the side where a security guard opened the velvet rope. Clara didn't go to the side. She stopped in the middle of the lobby, 10 paces from the podium. Cale took a deep breath. He didn't call her. He didn't extend his hand for her to come up. He just tilted his head a fraction, a gesture she understood as a question. And Clara, without answering, just stood there, feet firm on the cold marble, waiting. "Good morning," he said to the room, and his low voice made the journalist's murmur thin out. "I'm not going to read a prepared statement. I'm not going to put forward a lawyer. I'm going to answer what needs to be answered." Phelan beside him took off his glasses, blew on them, cleaned them, put them back on. He didn't disagree. He didn't interrupt. He just stood there. The photos published today are real. The context those photos suggest are not. There was no transaction, there was no arrangement, there was no improper use of anyone's image. There was a night that started at a bar in Tribeca and continued by the choice of the two people involved. A journalist at the front tried to cut in with a question. Cale lifted 2 fingers without aggression, and the woman waited. "I could treat this as an image crisis. I have a team for that. I have the option of lawsuits, of retractions, of bought silence." Clara felt her jaw lock when he used that word. "I'm not going to use any of them," Cale continued, and his voice dropped another notch like someone speaking inside a chapel. "Because the night was real. Because I did not touch her without permission. Because for the first time in a long time, I did not want to be admired. I wanted to be deserving. And that difference for a man like me is a big difference." There was a second of silence in the room that seemed to last longer than it should. Clara heard the small sound of a pen falling somewhere behind her. "I'm not going to name the person photographed," he finished. "She did not ask me to be introduced today. She didn't ask me for anything, in fact. That was what caught my attention from the start." The flashes came back, faster. Clara realized she was crying before she even felt the weight on her cheek. It wasn't a cry of anger. It was the cry of someone who had believed, and that was exactly the problem. Wren understood before she did, and pulled her by the hand. They went out through the side door, the same one the hotel staff used to come in with the laundry carts. Outside, a thin drizzle was falling, and the smell of wet asphalt mixed with the steam of a distant grill. Clara leaned against the wet brick wall and breathed 3 deep breaths before she could speak. "I really wanted him to defend himself," she murmured. "I know," Wren replied without letting go of her hand. "It would have been easier. I know." The cab back went down an avenue where the radio in the front seat was reporting the press conference on a loop. When the announcer played the line about being deserving instead of admired, Clara closed her eyes and rested her temple against the cold glass. The city was still grey. She still couldn't undo the knot. Within the broadcast, a reporter mentioned, in a quick tone, a sentence attributed to Cale backstage at the hotel, directed at Phelan about the photographer. "Offer him a decent job, but don't destroy his life." Clara opened her eyes. The announcer moved on to the next block as if the line were just another stock quote. She kept her temple against the glass, repeating the words inside until the next corner. That afternoon, at the apartment, Clara didn't answer her phone. Cale called twice. He sent a message with a single sentence. "Whenever you want, call me." He didn't call again. He didn't send flowers. He didn't send a car. He didn't send a lawyer. The absence of purchased gestures weighed on the empty room more than any presence would have weighed. Wren stayed until the night, made soup, talked about silly things, turned on the TV to an old show neither of them followed. The smell of warm broth in the kitchen tried without success to convince Clara that the world still had soft corners. At some point, she dozed off on the couch with her head on her friend's shoulder. She woke in the middle of the night to the blue flicker of the TV on the ceiling. "Ren," she called low. I believed him. I know. And now? Ren tapped twice on the back of the couch with her fingers before answering. "Now you sleep. Tomorrow you decide." But tomorrow didn't decide. Neither did the day after. The days started to pile up on each other like wet leaves. Clara went back to the studio. She worked. She ate little. She didn't answer her phone. Cale didn't push. He showed up once on the street outside the studio, on the other side of the sidewalk under a black umbrella, and stood there for a few minutes before walking away on foot. Clara saw him through the window, her forehead almost against the cold glass. She didn't go down. He didn't look up. 12 days passed. The city changed its light 3 times. The photos disappeared from the tabloids, replaced by some other scandal. Odette stopped showing up at events. Phelan sent through the office in a discreet envelope with no card the Duras book Clara had forgotten in Cale's car, but Clara returned the sealed envelope the next day with a 2-word note. Not yet. On the night of the 12th day, a rainy Thursday, Clara was alone in the studio in Long Island City, standing in front of a fresco in restoration, with the small brush suspended above gold dust. The smell of turpentine and old wax rose damp from the floorboards, and the noise of rain on the skylights fell in layers, like the muted applause of an invisible audience. She heard the door. Chapter 6. Rain, Book, and Morning. The studio in Long Island City smelled the way it always smelled. Solvent, cooked egg in tempera, gold dust that settled in the corners as if it were pollen. Outside, the rain had been falling heavily for 2 hours, beating on the zinc roof at a rhythm that filled the whole space. Clara had closed the doors early. She had sent the assistant home. She had stayed alone among frescoes in restoration, one of them a piece of wall pulled from a Tuscan chapel, with the face of a saint nearly worn away by time. Clara wouldn't even let herself admit anymore that she was waiting. She was crouched in front of the saint, fine brush in her hand, scraping at a crequelure when she heard the sound. 3 spaced knocks, firm, against the glass of the entrance. They weren't the short knocks of a delivery person. They weren't Ren's 2 short raps. They were 3 given by someone who wasn't in a hurry. She stayed still for a moment, brush suspended, her heart climbing into the base of her throat. She stood up slowly, feeling her numb knee protest. She crossed the studio without turning on any light, only the yellow glow of the bench lamp following her to the door, throwing long shadows on the concrete floor. Through the rain-fogged glass, she saw a dark shape, tall, standing with no umbrella, no driver behind, no car at the curb. Clara opened the door. Cale was soaked. The white shirt stuck to his chest, his dark hair dripping onto his forehead, his hands red with cold. He carried under his arm a rectangular package, wrapped in 2 layers of plastic, held against his body as if it were the only dry object within a kilometer's radius. He looked at Clara, the way someone checks to see if she's still there. "Can I come in?" he asked low. She hesitated a second. She stepped aside without answering. Cale crossed the threshold, leaving a small puddle on the concrete floor. He didn't take more than 3 steps inside. He stopped. He looked around at the covered canvases, at the table with pigments, at the easel where the Tuscan saint waited. When he looked at Clara again, he had the package in his hands, offered without ceremony. "You forgot this in the car," he said. 12 days ago." Clara lowered her eyes. She knew the shape. She took the bundle without saying anything and unwrapped the plastic right there, standing between him and the bench. The old cover appeared intact, the brick-red leather worn at the corners, Marguerite Duras's name in worn letters, the first edition he had found for her on an October dawn, in a bookstore hidden on Mercer Street. "Phelan tried to send it through the office," she murmured. "I know. I returned it sealed." "I know," he repeated, without changing his voice. Clara pressed the book against her chest, almost without realizing it. The leather was cold, slightly damp at the tips. She looked at Cale and saw him dripping water onto the concrete, not moving, not taking his eyes off her, with no sign of any hurry to explain himself. That posture, that waiting, was the same as at the Tribeca bar, at the grimy counter in Queens, in the cab pullback. The whole man was made of waiting. "You walked," she said, "from the station." "It's been raining for 3 hours." He nodded once. He didn't ask for a towel. He didn't ask to sit down. Clara breathed in deep. She set the book down carefully on the bench, next to the still damp brush, and crossed her arms. She felt her heart beat in a place in her chest she hadn't used in weeks. Irony, her oldest armor, tried to rise to her tongue and died before the first syllable. "What do you want, Cale?" He took a long time to answer. He looked at the floor for a moment, and when he looked at her again, his voice was even lower. "I didn't come to win the challenge." He paused briefly, weighing each word. "I came to lose everything that was keeping me from learning." Clara felt something tighten behind her sternum. She tried to laugh, an old automatic defense. The sound came out weak and died halfway. She turned her face away, pretended to look at the Tuscan saint, pretended it was the painting that demanded urgent attention. She felt her eyes burn before any tear. "You don't have to do this," she said, still with her back to him. "Not here. Not like this. I do." The simplicity of the word disarmed her more than any speech could have. Clara turned slowly. Cale was still in the same place, drenched, the package now resting on the bench between them, his empty hands hanging at his sides. She noticed, because she had already learned to read him in these small things, that his right hand was trembling slightly, held against his thigh. The same tremor as in the big rooms, the same tremor as in the bar. She took a step toward him. Small. He didn't move. "You didn't even bring a car," Clara said, and her voice came out hoarse. "I didn't want you hearing the engine outside. You're dripping on my floor." He looked at the puddle at his feet. For the first time that night, something like a very brief smile crossed the corner of his mouth. "I can apologize for the floor," he said, "but not for the rest." Clara took another step. She was close enough now to feel the cold rising from his wet shirt, the smell of rain mixed with the neutral soap she already recognized, and under all of it, a trace of cedar that came from his skin. She lifted her hand slowly, as if she herself were calculating each centimeter, and touched the drenched fabric at his shoulder. It was cold, heavy, real. Cale closed his eyes for just a second. She saw it. "I believed in you," Clara said softly, "and that brought me down harder than if you had lied." "I know. You don't know." "Then explain it to me." She swallowed dryly. She looked at his mouth, then his eyes. The frescoes around them seemed to have stepped back 2 paces, as though the whole studio were leaning toward the small space between them. "I spent my whole life watching my mother get up every day after a man who promised the world and disappeared," Clara said. "I swore I would never let anyone promise me anything. When you didn't defend yourself at that press conference, I couldn't take it, because a man who defends himself with pride, I know how to hate. A man who kneels, I don't." Cale was silent. He didn't try to fix the sentence. He didn't try to complete the story. He just lifted his hand, the one that was trembling, and brought it to her face without touching it yet, paused in the air a finger's width from her cheek. Waiting. Again, waiting. Clara closed her eyes. She tilted her face against his palm. She chose. He touched. The kiss happened without warning and without rush, exactly where they were, between the Tuscan saint on the left and the covered canvases on the right, under the yellow light of the bench lamp, and the rain still beating on the zinc roof. It was slow in a way that hurt. Cale had his hands on the sides of her face, icy at first, warming in the heat of her skin. Clara was holding the front of his soaked shirt as if she needed an anchor, feeling the heavy fabric run between her fingers. When they separated, he pressed his forehead to hers. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. Their breathing was the only sound inside the sound of the rain. "You're freezing," Clara whispered finally. "I am," he admitted. "Come on." She grabbed the studio key, switched off the bench lamp, and left the Tuscan saint behind her for the first time in weeks. They walked out together to the sidewalk. The rain had eased to a thin drizzle, and the air carried the damp smell of asphalt and the nearby river. A cab passed, stopped at her wave. In the back seat, Cale placed his hand on her waist. He didn't pull back. She didn't move away. They crossed the bridge in silence, the city blurred on the other side of the fogged glass, the yellow lights reflected in long puddles on the asphalt. At some point, Clara rested her head on his soaked shoulder and noticed with a new strangeness that she wasn't tired of being touched. They went up to the apartment in the Lower East Side. The key turned in the lock. The door closed. The light that came in through the window the next morning was pale, washed by the rain of the night before, the kind that made everything inside the bedroom a little slower. The sheet smelled of Clara's soap and of something new, warmer, a faint trace of skin and cedar mixed with cotton. She woke up little by little without a start, and it took her a while to understand why the chest beneath her head was rising and falling in a different rhythm than her own. Cale was still asleep. He was on his side, turned toward her, his dry hair tousled against the pillow, one of his hands resting on her waist over the sheet. His fingers were open. They weren't holding her. They were simply there, resting, like someone confirming a choice without claiming anything. Clara stayed still for a long time, watching the light climb the wall in a tired yellow, almost grain by grain. Outside, someone was opening a metal shutter on the ground floor. A distant siren was passing. A pigeon was cooing on the windowsill. The life of the city went on indifferent. Inside the bedroom, nothing seemed to be in a hurry. She looked at his hand open on her waist. She remembered the cab under the fine drizzle weeks before, the short pullback that had disarmed her more than any gift. She remembered the counter in Queens, the boy's name repeated in a low voice. She remembered the bookstore on Mercer Street. She remembered his voice at the press conference. She remembered the rain dripping on the concrete floor of the studio 12 hours earlier, and the kiss that had lingered as if measuring the weight of every breath. There was no ring. There was no promise. There was a hand open on her waist, and a pale morning and the sound of his breathing rising and falling next to hers. Clara closed her eyes. The question came slowly, with no strength to hurt, but with the whole weight of everything she had carried up to that point. Was peace of this size really possible for someone like her? She didn't try to answer. She couldn't yet. She just rested her own hand on his, fingers against fingers, and stayed like that, listening to the rain finally finish falling outside.
Hey, Rowan here. That's it for Book 1, but guess what? Book 2 is already done. You can grab access to it for just a small fee.
For almost 5 months, Clara Vane believed that Cale Ashford had changed. He left tea on her counter, remembered names no one remembered, and touched her as if he had learned to love without possessing. Clara almost believed that, this time, a rich man would not enter her life to buy, to break, or to erase what was left, until she found out that Cale's empire had already signed the sentence to destroy something that was important to her. Now Cale would have to make a choice, lose a fortune to save what she loved, or lose Clara forever. And when he finally chose, it might be too late. The question that remains is simple and devastating. This time, will he choose love or the power that has always defined who he is?
Like I said, that was just a taste of Book 2. To watch it uncensored, just click on the first link here in the pinned comment. I'll see you on the other side in a few seconds. Remember, just click on the first link down here in the comments, and Book 2 complete, no ads, no interruptions, will already be available for you. It's very simple. Book 2 is something I'm loving making. You're loving it too, so I promise there will be more. It's where you find increasingly spicy stories, a true dark romance. And precisely because this version is getting more and more heated, the video isn't well accepted publicly on YouTube. This closed environment is where I can actually share my essence and where I feel free to do my best work for you. More news coming soon. I'll be waiting for you on the other side. Now, unfortunately, a lot of people have been downloading our audio, effectively copying the entire story, and just re-uploading it to YouTube. If you want to watch the original story and be the first to get the next ones, search for My Stories by Rowan on YouTube for the best Billionaire and CEO Romance content. Remember, the official channel is My Stories by Rowan on YouTube and the My Stories platform. I'll be waiting for you there. Love, Rowan. Congratulations! Your purchase has been confirmed, and you now have full access to Books 1 and 2 of all our stories, completely ad-free and uninterrupted. Everything is available on the My Stories platform. From Mafia Romance and Billionaire Romance to our spicier tales, this content is ready for you now, with new episodes added daily. Access is simple. Just log in using the same email address you used for your purchase. A confirmation has also been sent to that same email. The My Stories platform is very simple and intuitive. Each image represents a story. If it has a book too, just click and press play. Everything is already unlocked for you. You can also rate each story, leave a like, and write a comment. Your feedback will be visible to all our other subscribers. This is our romance universe, so please feel free to interact. From this moment on, this is officially your home for romance stories. Just head over to mystoriesromance.com and press play. Welcome to the family.